What's going on, everybody, and welcome to my second Wheel of Time diary, where this week we're obviously continuing my journey through the Wheel of Time and the Eye of the World, more specifically book 1 in the series. I had a great time reading this week. I would say it was probably even better than my first week of reading in terms of my enjoyment of what I read. I'm not really sure if I can specify why for certain, especially since this morning I didn't read very much and I didn't actually read anything at all from any book yesterday. So it's just kind of been one of those weeks. This month is going to be that way basically the entire way through. The amount of time that I spent reading this week was before this morning actually very comparable to the amount of time that I spent reading last week. Last week I read about 5.25 hours or so. This week I read for about 6.5 hours. So my total reading time at this point is just under 12 hours. And I don't even know what percent of the way through the book I am. I'm gonna have to do a quick calculation just to see. I'm about 36% of the way through the book, so a little bit over a third of the way through, based on the fact that I plan to have this book read in approximately 5 weeks. And where I am right now, I'm actually about 30 pages behind schedule, but considering that I was about 30 or 40 pages behind schedule last week, I'm actually staying pretty consistent on that. I got most of what I needed to get read this week. Theoretically, next week I should be able to get a lot more done, but if not, then the last 2 weeks of May, I know I certainly will, because most of the stuff that's been crazy about my life the last couple weeks has been a little bit more chill. But out of enjoyment levels of what I did read this last week, I would say it is once again. Did I say it was 5 stars last week? I think I did. Well, this week was also 5 stars if that's the case. I don't really have too much to say in the spoiler-free section other than I like the direction that the story is going. I like the developments that Jordan has started to include in terms of the story and the characters, especially some of the ways that these characters interact with each other. There's a couple things that I'll specify on that a little bit later. But especially like the journey itself, I find to be really enjoyable to read about up to this point, especially since the chapters that I read this week, I can actually see a lot more of the Tolkien inspirations, a lot more of the Tolkien-like elements in this book that I feel like a lot of people say Jordan ripped off Fellowship of the Ring here. Up to the point that I'm not going to say that he ripped off Fellowship at all. I can see a couple of those inspirations rather explicitly, but I wouldn't say that any of it is a rip-off. I'm really enjoying the way that Jordan has developed the story and the world so far, and I'm liking the way that it is currently going. It is keeping my interest for sure, especially where the journey itself is involved. But that's probably going to be the end of the spoiler-free section of this. I'm a little bit tired and I don't want to accidentally spoil anything in this section. So I'm just going to move right into the spoiler field. So in terms of the chapter listing, chapter 10 is the time when the party actually starts to leave Emond's Field. So chapter 9 is when Rand has his first dream sequence, or at least I believe it's when he has his first dream sequence, and it's also when he wakes up to find that Tam is actually alive and seemingly like he's going to make a full recovery, which, as I said last week, I'm very excited by that fact because I really like Tam as a character. I don't know how much we'll be able to see of him through the series, if at all, but just the fact that he didn't have to die for this journey to commence, it has me, happy enough as is. But in terms of the dream sequence, I really liked the way that the shifts and the folds of it felt supernatural. I read some other authors who like to do dream sequences a lot. One of these in particular is Rick Riordan. Now, Rick Riordan is a YA author, but I feel it's fair to compare because I've heard, at least when I was talking about my reactions to some of the dream sequences in this book so far, a lot of people said that there are a lot of dream sequences in the series, and if that's the case, if they all happen to hold up to this type of quality, I'm actually rather excited about that fact. But in comparison to Rick Riordan, I would say Riordan isn't quite so smooth with his dream sequences. There's one series in particular, the Kane Chronicles, that uses dreams a lot, probably a lot more than he should, and some of them feel really kind of forced, like, they feel more like plot scenes that you couldn't fit into the book in any other way than they do feel like actual dreams. in chapter 9 specifically, I would say the dream sequence felt like an actual dream. The next dream sequence that I'm going to talk about later doesn't have that quality to it, but there's a specific reason why I feel like that was more intentional in that way. So the shifts and the folds of this dream sequence, I just wanted to point out I really enjoyed. But finally, after Rand waking up and them starting to prepare to leave, and the whole gathering of the peoples outside of the inn at Emmons Field saying that Moraine needs to go because they don't like the Aes Sedai. I really liked this scene because Moraine attempts to stop it, or does manage to stop it, and kind of shame the people out of, being aggressive, I suppose, by telling them a story of the history of the two rivers. I really liked this sequence specifically because of the way that it reminded me of Gandalf from Fellowship of the Ring. This is one of those Fellowship inspirations that I feel like I recognized rather well. In Fellowship of the Ring in Chapter 2, Gandalf does a lot of sort of lore and history and exposition telling to Frodo, a lot of it dealing with the One Ring specifically, and I really liked that chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters of that first book within Fellowship, because Fellowship is 2 books. We don't need to get into that. I really liked the way this chapter in Eye of the World handled that sort of similar type of thing, because it shows that there is a history to the world, a history to this very small area as well. Even if we don't get all the details of it, Robert Jordan was willing to give us enough of it that we understand, hey, there's a rich history to even this really small town. You're not going to get all of it, but you get all of the main details, and you will be able to understand it to the degree that all of the citizens of the town understand it as well, and that's kind of what makes it work. It was really fun stuff. Chapter 10 with leave taking was when the party actually decides to leave Emmons Field. I found this chapter to honestly be a little bit humorous, just kind of the way that some of the characters pop in to join the party, such as Egwene kind of popping out of nowhere and Tom being hidden in the loft of all things. I for whatever reason, I found this chapter to be a little bit humorous in that way, and I kind of decided at this point, I'm like, okay, I'm all in on some of these characters. There may be a couple interactions that we've had up to this point that kind of that I wasn't huge fans of, but I feel like they're more indicative of, specific parts of the world rather than the way that Jordan wrote them. So I'm not concerned about that element quite so much, but I really enjoyed this. All of the travels, though, so all of the rest of the chapters, well, most of the rest of the chapters that I read this week are basically dealing with the travels, whether that be going from Emmons Field to Barillon. I hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm sorry if I did not. And then going from Barillon all the way up to... I literally just read it this morning when they come across the abandoned city that doesn't have people living in it anymore. That's huge compared to Barillon. It's at the end of chapter 16, 17. It's at the end of chapter 18, sorry, the end of chapter 18, which is called the Camelin Road. So it's when they come across that city. I haven't actually entered that city yet because that doesn't happen until chapter 19. But most of these chapters are encompassed by travels, and I thought the travels were actually surprisingly good. One of the things that I think some people struggle with in Fellowship of the Ring, a lot of people like to say it's because of Tolkien's, habit of describing every little thing. And I don't think that's the truth. He does a little bit of that. But if you enjoy his prose, it's not noticeable. But even if you do enjoy his prose and you notice this, I think the main issue with the travels and Fellowship of the Ring that most people have, especially modern day readers who just need stuff happening all the time, I think the main struggle that people have with Fellowship is that there's not a whole lot that actually happens on the actual travels themselves. If I'm thinking back to when I read that book about a year and a half ago, I remember next to nothing of what actually happened in the early stages of those travels, except for, say, the stuff with Tom Bombadil, so the stuff through the Old Forest. That's basically all of the travels through that first part of Fellowship that I actually remember. So all of the travels leading up to Elrond, I suppose, because I can't remember the city name for whatever reason. All of that stuff was rather chill in terms of stuff that actually happens. I mean, towards the end, some action starts to happen with the ring race, but it's not like a whole lot of crazy stuff. It's not a whole lot of action. The travels in comparison in Eye of the World have all been action. Even when they're the slower moments, there's still the tension that the characters feel of being followed or of potentially being caught or whatever the case may be, that you can tell is still there. And even intermixed in these two specific legs of travel was a chapter set in Barrelon itself with the Stag and Lion, chapter 14. Lots of interesting story elements were introduced here with the Children of the Light, which I think is a cool idea and concept to have that I feel like we're going to see, probably a lot of through the rest of the series, if not in the rest of these first early books. I'm not sure what type of role the Children of the Light will encompass through the rest of the series, but I really like the introduction that they had here. But chapter 14 was also when we had the really good dream sequence with Rand that basically explained the entirety of the prologue. So the prologue is kind of the story of Luz Theron, I think his name is, and the Dark One, essentially. And this dream sequence of Rand is the Dark One, essentially telling him the explanation of that prologue within the dream. And I thought that was a really cool way to do that, instead of leaving the prologue super vague and being like, okay, well, what does any of this mean? Because that's how I felt when I read the prologue last week. I was like, okay, well, I really like this. I'm not entirely sure what it meant or what happened, but I like what I read. This dream sequence pretty much explained what that prologue did, and I really liked that about it. In fact, I would say that this dream sequence in chapter 14, is probably my favorite independent scene of the book so far. I think chapters 7 and 8 might still be my favorite chapters, but this scene within chapter 14 is probably still my favorite. But in chapter 15 as well, chapters 15 through 17, I suppose I should say, are all kind of stuff that take place within Barrelon. So I didn't even realize that there was so much time spent in this city, but that's actually really great. In chapter 15, we get to meet a couple new characters. We get to see some interactions between them that is really interesting, including the first interaction that Rand has had with Min. And I'm not entirely sure what type of role Min's going to play in the story, but based off of what I got here, I'm anticipating that she's probably going to be important. She came off as a little creepy here, but even though she came off as creepy in this chapter, I will say that she's probably the only female character up to this point that I think I don't have any form of natural aversion to. Even despite her being creepy, I still didn't feel like I had any aversion to her. I don't know why, but that's just kind of how things were. Then the last few chapters that I read had to do kind of with Nynaeve coming back to join the party because she was searching for the friends so that she could try to bring them back to Emond's Field. Chapter 16 was definitely a trip. I used a pretty not nice word to describe Nynaeve in my chapter thoughts, but that's fine because I don't like her character at the moment, the way that she's behaving. Just kind of the way she goes about doing stuff. Like, I don't have anything against what Nynaeve's trying to do specifically because she has a point and she's not wrong, but the way that she says basically everything just makes her come off really not fun at all. Like, it's just not good. And I'm trying not to curse in these videos because I don't like to curse in these videos for whatever reason, even though I curse a lot in real life. That's besides the point. The point is that Nynaeve coming into the party was something that I'm a little bit hesitant about. Moving forward, we'll kind of see how developments with the characters go from this point forward, but I'm not totally against it because it provides a little bit more interest. But what really has me excited to move on continuing forward reading this week is what happened at the end of chapter 17 and in chapter 18, when the party decided that they had to leave Barrelon immediately because there was a Fade in Barrelon who's just straight up like grabbed and talked to Rand directly within the inn. That was a pretty creepy scene that I thought was really interesting. I'm kind of surprised that kind of a scene actually happened, but I liked it nonetheless. But the party leaving and Moraine showing off a little bit more of her powers in ways that are kind of low-key terrifying, especially when they were trying to escape and the Children of the Light tried to stop them. I thought that was a really interesting scene. But then, of course, chapter 18 right after that with the Camelin Road and the whole party being pursued by, what was it, a minimum of 4 Fades that I actually remember being mentioned on screen. There was the first one that had the head missing after Lan fought it. And then when they continued forward, and then there was the group of 3 with all of their Trollocs behind. So this was kind of like a sort of mini battle sequence, sort of. It wasn't described super in detail, but since Rand himself, as he's not necessarily the narrator, but as the narrator said through Rand's point of view, saying that he didn't remember any particular part of the battle, just that it was like, oh, this is what battle feels like. I thought that this little bit of an action sequence was quite nice, and I'm excited to see how these travels continue with that, with this ever-looming threat of more Fades, the Myrddraal, and all the Trollocs. Like, I'm very excited to see where this goes, especially with this place that Lan and... Is that his name? Lan and Moraine keep talking about, or that Lan keeps mentioning specifically as a place that the Trollocs won't go to, or that the Fades won't go to. Kind of curious what this place is, if that's what this big city that they have just approached is, if that's what Lan is talking about. I'm interested, but also kind of scared to see why he would consider that. And if it's not the place, then I'm interested to see what that place might be, and again, why it would be a place that, you know, the Trollocs and Fades don't want to go to, or wouldn't be willing to go to at first. So that's kind of where I have left off reading at the moment, is, you know, stopping at the spot where they're just approaching the city of, let's see, its true name, as Moraine just called it at the very end of chapter 18, was Shadar Logoth. However it's pronounced. Sorry, I'm going to butcher every name in this series. That's going to be something you're just going to deal with. I apologize, but that's basically where I've stopped, is the party starting to venture into this abandoned, or so it seems, abandoned city. So I've really enjoyed what I've read. I'm very interested to continue. The fact that I'm only a third of the way through this book has me really interested, and the fact that I've been so engaged throughout the entire thing is really nice, because I've heard, you know, all of the comparisons that I've heard from this book to Fellowship of the Ring specifically is one of those things I was like, you know, had me a little bit anxious, even though I loved Fellowship of the Ring. I think it's... I loved Return of the King, though. I don't know if Fellowship of the Ring is my favorite of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but if it's not, it's definitely up there. I love Fellowship a lot, but I do remember the first time that I tried to read it many years ago, and the first time that I actually read it in full a few years after that, and I just remember it not being a book that I loved. Like, the reason that I never finished it the first time I tried to read it was because it was too boring. It was because Tolkien did too much describing, you know, there wasn't enough actually happening. It was kind of a similar thing when I got through it the next time. I just kind of plowed through as quick as I could so that I could get to the 2 towers, and genuinely did not remember pretty much anything from the book when I actually went and read the full trilogy a year and a half ago. But the point that I'm making is, I was anxious about the way that people described this as being very Fellowship of the Ring-esque in a lot of ways, and I was like, okay, well, that doesn't bode well, because Fellowship is kind of slow. It is kind of, you know, meandery to some extent with the travels and stuff like that. And since this book is, you know, since this book is like the length of 2 Lord of the Ring books combined, it's like, okay, well, that's kind of concerning, but I can safely say that I've thoroughly enjoyed my time with this. And I gotta say, Robert Jordan's prose, at least in this first book, is very, very good. Like, it's just been super enjoyable to read. It's not as beautiful as Tolkien's prose at all, but for what it is, I really love what is going on in this book. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video here. I don't really have that much to say, and I have another commitment that I have to go get ready for, like, immediately after finishing this recording. So if you have any thoughts on, you know, my reactions to the story thus far, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I appreciate anybody who's willing to join me on kind of this journey with my Wheel of Time Diaries. I'm excited to continue reading. Thank you guys for watching this video. I'll be back again next Tuesday with a review of 127 Hours Between a Rock and a Hard Place by Aaron Ralston. So a little bit of a different review than I normally cover here. But next Thursday, I'll be back again with my 3rd Wheel of Time diary after reading however much of the book I managed to get read this next week. So thank you guys again for watching. I'll be back then.